If someone asked you when muscle strength begins to disappear, most people would probably give the same answer. After someone becomes weak. After they stop walking. After they need help getting out of a chair. Sounds reasonable. In fact, that's exactly what Emily used to believe. Her mother, Margaret, was 74 years old. She still woke up before sunrise. She still watered the roses every morning. She still baked the blueberry muffins Sophie loved on weekends. She still laughed at the same old family stories everyone had heard 100 times before. If you spent an afternoon with Margaret, you probably wouldn't notice anything unusual. She wasn't frail. She wasn't sick. She wasn't complaining about getting older. She was simply living the quiet life she had always loved. Then one ordinary morning, something almost invisible happened. Margaret reached into the kitchen cabinet, took out a small glass jar of homemade strawberry jam, wrapped one hand around the lid, and tried to open it. She smiled, turned it once. Then again, the lid didn't move. Without saying a word, she gently placed the jar on the counter. A few seconds later, Emily walked into the kitchen. She picked up the same jar, twisted the lid, and it opened almost effortlessly. Neither of them said anything. Margaret simply smiled. "Thank you." The conversation moved on. Breakfast continued. Sophie arrived a little later, full of energy, asking for toast with strawberry jam. Within minutes, everyone had forgotten about the jar. Everyone. Except Emily. Because later that evening, one quiet question stayed with her. When did opening a simple jar become something her mother no longer did without help? And she had no idea that this tiny moment would completely change the way she understood growing older. The next morning, life looked exactly the same. Margaret was already in the garden before the neighborhood had fully awakened. The roses still needed watering. The birds still gathered along the fence. The soft spring breeze still carried the familiar scent of fresh grass through the open kitchen window. Emily almost smiled at herself. Maybe she had made too much of such a small moment. After all, everyone struggles with a stubborn jar once in a while. She decided to forget about it. For a few days, she did. But something unexpected began to happen. Not because Margaret suddenly became weaker. Because Emily quietly began noticing the little moments she had never really seen before. One afternoon, Margaret carried 2 grocery bags from the car. Instead of lifting both at once, she picked up one, walked inside, then came back for the second. There was nothing dramatic about it. In fact, it looked perfectly sensible. A few days later, Sophie asked her grandmother to help move a flower pot to a sunnier corner of the porch. Margaret smiled warmly. She rested both hands on the pot, paused for just a moment, then gently slid it across the wooden floor instead of lifting it. And nothing seemed wrong. Nothing looked painful. Nothing looked alarming. Another morning, Emily noticed Margaret using both hands to pour tea from a heavy ceramic kettle. She had probably done that many times before. Emily simply had never paid attention. Each moment, by itself, was completely ordinary. Each one had a simple explanation. But together, they quietly began telling a different story. Not a story about illness. Not a story about weakness. A story about tiny adjustments. Small decisions. Barely noticeable changes that made everyday life feel just a little easier. That evening, Emily found herself standing alone in the kitchen. Her eyes rested on the same strawberry jam jar. It suddenly wasn't about the jar anymore. It was about all the little moments surrounding it. Moments so ordinary that no one ever thought to remember them. And for the first time, Emily asked herself a question she had never considered before. Feeding well, staying active, and feeling healthy were all still true. Why did these tiny changes seem to be happening anyway? It wasn't a question the internet could answer with a simple headline. She wanted someone who could explain it, without making her feel afraid. Someone who understood growing older, not as a problem to fix, but as a journey to understand. Almost without thinking, One familiar name came quietly to her mind. Dr. Carter. And somehow, she already felt that the next conversation might change far more than she expected. Emily waited until the following week before making the appointment. There was no emergency. Nothing dramatic had happened. Margaret was still tending her roses. She still baked for Sophie. She still laughed at the same stories around the dinner table. Light looked almost exactly the same. And yet, Emily couldn't stop thinking about that glass jar. Not because of the jar itself, but because it had quietly changed the way she was seeing everything else. When the appointment day arrived, Dr. Carter welcomed them with the same calm smile Margaret had known for years. There was no rush, no clipboard filled with questions, no sense that anyone was searching for bad news. Instead, they talked about ordinary things, the unusually warm spring weather, the tomatoes Margaret planned to grow that summer, the colorful butterflies Sophie had been trying to photograph in the backyard. For several minutes, it felt less like visiting a doctor's office, and more like sitting with an old family friend. Finally, Emily took a slow breath. There has been something on my mind. Dr. Carter nodded gently. Take your time. Emily smiled. It may not even be important. She paused for a moment. I've simply started noticing little things. She described the jar, the flower pot, the grocery bags, the heavy kettle. None of those moments seemed serious by themselves, but somehow, they no longer felt completely unrelated. When she finished, the room became quiet. Margaret smiled softly. I've been wondering when you were finally going to ask. Emily looked surprised. You knew. Margaret laughed. I knew you'd been watching me. Everyone smiled. The conversation felt lighter, not heavier. Dr. Carter waited until the laughter faded naturally. Then he leaned forward just a little. Emily, may I ask you something? She nodded. When you think about muscle strength, what is the very first thing that comes to mind? Emily answered almost immediately. Exercise. Dr. Carter smiled. I hear that answer almost every day. He paused. And it explains why so many families misunderstand what they're actually seeing. Emily looked puzzled. What do you mean? Instead of answering, Dr. Carter asked another question. If someone eats well, stays active, and still enjoys everyday life, would you expect their muscles to stay exactly the same forever? Emily thought for a long moment. She had never really considered it. I suppose. I always assumed they would. Dr. Carter nodded gently. Most people do. He glanced toward Margaret before looking back at Emily. And that's exactly where today's conversation begins. Dr. Carter smiled. Let me tell you a story. He looked toward the kitchen visible through the small window beside his office. Imagine someone owns a beautiful cast-iron skillet. They cook with it almost every day. They clean it carefully. They season it properly. They never mistreat it. Emily nodded. It should last a very long time. It usually does, Dr. Carter replied. But only if it continues being used. He paused. If someone places that same pan in a cabinet and leaves it there for months, nothing dramatic happens overnight. It still looks like the same pan. It still feels heavy. It hasn't suddenly become useless. But little by little, it no longer performs the way it once did. Emily listened quietly. So, you're saying our muscles are similar? Dr. Carter smiled. In some ways. Yes. He folded his hands comfortably. Our muscles are remarkably efficient. They're always paying attention. They quietly ask one simple question every day. How much strength does this person really need? Emily looked thoughtful. And they adjust? They do. If you regularly carry grocery bags, your muscles remember. If you enjoy gardening, they remember. If you climb stairs every day, they remember that too. He paused again. But they also notice when certain movements become less common. They don't disappear. They simply adapt. Margaret smiled softly. So the body is always trying to be efficient. Exactly. It never wastes energy if it doesn't have to. Dr. Carter leaned back slightly. That's one of the reasons the human body is so extraordinary. It changes quietly, long before most of us notice. Emily thought about the strawberry jam jar. She wasn't thinking about weak hands anymore. She was thinking about countless ordinary days. Days that had slowly shaped the way Margaret's body responded to everyday life. Dr. Carter continued. Many people believe muscles become weaker because birthdays keep passing. He gently shook his head. Birthdays tell us how long we've lived. They don't decide how our muscles respond. Our muscles respond to something much more personal. How we live. How often we move. How confidently we use them. Margaret smiled. So my body has been listening to me all these years. Dr. Carter returned the smile. It has. And the remarkable part is, it never really stops listening. Emily felt another piece of the puzzle quietly fall into place. This wasn't a story about something being lost. It was a story about a body that had been adapting every single day for more than 70 years. Emily sat quietly for a moment. Then she asked the question that had been growing inside her ever since the morning with the strawberry jam. If the body changes this gradually, why don't we notice? Dr. Carter smiled. Because almost nothing changes all at once. He paused. Most families imagine weakness arriving like a storm. It almost never does. It usually arrives like the changing of the seasons. So slowly that every day still feels almost exactly like the one before. Emily nodded. That felt strangely familiar. Dr. Carter continued. Nobody wakes up one morning unable to carry a grocery bag. It usually begins much more quietly. He looked toward Margaret. One day, someone carries 2 grocery bags instead of 3. A few months later, they choose to make 2 trips instead of 1. They don't even think about it. They simply do what feels comfortable. Margaret smiled. I've probably done that. So have I, Dr. Carter said with a gentle laugh. And so have most people. The room filled with quiet smiles. He continued. Sometimes, someone reaches for a lighter pan. Not because they have to. Because it simply feels easier. They begin using both hands for a heavy kettle. They slide a flower pot. Instead of lifting it, they ask someone else to open a tightly sealed jar. Emily remembered each of those moments. Not one of them had seemed important. Not one of them had looked frightening. Each one had simply become part of everyday life. Dr. Carter folded his hands. That is why families often miss the earliest changes. Every small adjustment makes perfect sense. And because it makes sense, no one stops to ask why it has become necessary. Emily lowered her eyes. She suddenly realized something. If she had never noticed the jam jar, she might never have noticed any of the other moments either. Dr. Carter continued quietly. Our bodies are incredibly intelligent. When something becomes just a little more difficult, they almost always find an easier way. We naturally change how we carry, how we lift, how we reach, how we hold. And eventually, those new ways simply begin to feel normal. Margaret smiled softly. So sometimes, I've already adapted. Before I even realize I've changed. Dr. Carter nodded. Exactly. And adaptation isn't failure. It's one of the most remarkable things your body knows how to do. Emily felt her shoulders relax. For days, she had been looking for signs that something was going wrong. Now, she was beginning to see something entirely different. Not weakness, not failure, but a lifetime of quiet adjustments, made by a body that had spent more than 70 years trying to help Margaret continue living the life she loved. And somehow, that realization felt far less frightening than anything Emily had imagined before. Emily smiled softly. So, if our bodies adapt this naturally, does that mean there's anything we can do? Dr. Carter smiled almost immediately. I'm very glad you asked. He leaned back comfortably, because this is usually the part people don't expect. He looked toward Margaret. Our muscles are always paying attention, but they aren't waiting for perfect workouts. They're waiting for ordinary life. Emily looked surprised. What do you mean? Dr. Carter smiled. Think about Sophie. Margaret laughed quietly. She never lets me sit still for very long. Exactly. He chuckled. When Sophie asks you to walk across the yard, your body is learning. When you bend down to look at a flower, your body is learning. When you carry a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden, your body is learning. Emily listened carefully. So everyday life matters more than people realize. It often does. Dr. Carter nodded. Many people imagine strength only grows inside a fitness center. But for most older adults, confidence grows inside their own home. He paused. In the kitchen. In the garden. On the front porch. While playing with grandchildren. Margaret smiled. I like those places much better than a gym. So do I, Dr. Carter replied with a gentle laugh. The body doesn't always know whether you're exercising. It simply recognizes movement. It notices effort. It notices repetition. And little by little, it responds. Emily thought about the past week. She remembered Margaret carrying a small watering can from one flower bed to another. She remembered her stretching gently to place a favorite mug on the highest kitchen shelf. She remembered Sophie asking her to help build a tiny stone path through the garden. None of those moments had looked like exercise. They had simply looked like life. Dr. Carter continued. One comfortable movement may not seem important, but hundreds of comfortable movements quietly become part of how the body stays capable. Emily nodded slowly. So we don't need to chase perfection. Dr. Carter smiled warmly. No. We simply keep giving the body reasons to stay involved. Margaret looked toward the window. The roses still need watering every morning. Dr. Carter smiled. That's a wonderful reason. Emily laughed. And Sophie will always find another adventure. I have no doubt. The room filled with gentle laughter. For the first time since the strawberry jam jar, Emily wasn't wondering how to prevent every small change. She was thinking about something much more hopeful. How ordinary mornings, ordinary gardens, ordinary family moments could quietly help Margaret continue living the life she loved. And somehow, those ordinary moments suddenly felt far more valuable than they ever had before. Several days passed. Life quietly settled back into its familiar rhythm. The morning still began with sunlight pouring through the kitchen windows. Margaret still enjoyed her first cup of tea before anyone else was awake. She still walked slowly into the garden. She still stopped to admire every new flower that had opened overnight. At first glance, nothing had really changed. But for Emily, everything had. She no longer found herself watching every jar, every grocery bag, or every heavy pan. She wasn't quietly measuring what her mother could or couldn't do anymore. Instead, she began noticing everything Margaret still loved doing. She noticed how carefully Margaret trimmed the roses without rushing. She noticed how naturally she laughed whenever Sophie invented another backyard adventure. She noticed the patience in her hands while arranging fresh flowers inside a simple glass vase. Those were the moments that now held her attention. One Saturday morning, Sophie ran into the garden carrying a small watering can almost as big as she was. Great-grandma! Margaret smiled immediately. Without hesitation, she walked over. Together, they watered one flower bed after another. Sometimes Sophie spilled more water onto her shoes than onto the flowers. Margaret simply laughed. Emily watched quietly from the porch. Only a few weeks earlier, she would have been studying every movement. She would have been wondering whether Margaret seemed weaker than before. Now, she found herself watching something entirely different. She watched the joy, the patience, the connection between 4 generations sharing one peaceful morning. For a long time, Emily believed loving someone meant protecting them from every possible difficulty. Now, she understood something different. Sometimes, love means seeing the whole person, not just the challenge they're facing. She remembered something Dr. Carter had said. The body keeps listening. The body keeps adapting. Perhaps families could learn to do the same, not by ignoring change, but by refusing to let change become the only thing they see. That afternoon, Margaret carried a small basket of freshly cut herbs back toward the kitchen. Emily noticed the basket. She smiled. Then, almost without thinking, she looked away, not because she no longer cared, but because she no longer needed to measure every movement. She trusted her mother. She trusted what she had learned. And most importantly, she trusted that understanding would always be stronger than fear. As warm afternoon sunlight drifted across the garden, Emily realized something she never expected. Perhaps the biggest change over the past few weeks had not happened inside Margaret's muscles. It had happened inside her own heart. A few weeks later, life looked almost exactly the way it always had. The roses continued to bloom outside the kitchen window. Sophie still searched the garden for butterflies every weekend. Margaret still smiled whenever the morning sunlight reached her favorite chair. Nothing about those ordinary days seemed extraordinary, and perhaps that was the greatest gift of all. Emily stood quietly on the front porch one peaceful afternoon. She watched her mother walk slowly across the garden path. There was no hurry, no performance, no need to prove anything. Just another beautiful ordinary day. For a long moment, Emily found herself remembering the strawberry jam jar. Only a few weeks earlier, that small moment had filled her with fear. Now, it filled her with understanding. She finally realized something. Strength isn't something we usually notice while it's quietly carrying us through everyday life. We notice it only when one ordinary moment asks for just a little more than yesterday. She smiled gently, not because every answer had become clear, but because the questions no longer frightened her. She understood now that growing older wasn't a story about losing everything. It was a story about continuing to live well, while the body quietly adapted along the way. Margaret looked up from the flower bed and smiled toward the porch. Emily smiled back. Nothing needed to be said. Some moments become meaningful, without a single word. As a light spring breeze moved softly through the garden, Emily realized that love had changed for her. It no longer meant watching every movement with quiet anxiety. It meant paying attention, without becoming afraid. It meant learning enough to replace worry with understanding. It meant protecting not only someone's health, but also their dignity, their independence, and the simple routines that gave each day its meaning. Perhaps that was the quiet lesson hidden inside an ordinary glass jar. Not every small change is a reason to panic. Sometimes, simply an invitation to care a little more wisely. Growing older isn't about holding on to the strength you once had. It's about protecting the life that strength still allows you to enjoy. Several weeks later, life continued much the same as it always had. The kitchen still filled with the smell of fresh coffee each morning. The garden still welcomed the first light of day. Margaret still enjoyed caring for her roses before the neighborhood became busy. Some mornings, she still asked Emily to loosen the lid on a tightly closed jar. And somehow, that no longer seemed important because Emily had learned to see something much bigger. She no longer measured her mother's life by one difficult task. She measured it by everything her mother still loved doing. One quiet afternoon, Margaret and Emily stopped by Dr. Carter's office to say hello after a routine visit. There were no medical tests, no examination room, no complicated conversations. They simply stood together near the front entrance, talking for a few peaceful minutes before heading home. Dr. Carter looked toward Margaret with a gentle smile. She looked relaxed, comfortable, confident, not because every movement had become effortless, but because she had never stopped living the life that gave those movements meaning. Emily smiled. "I think I understand now." Dr. Carter nodded warmly. The body changes throughout life, but understanding those changes often changes a family even more. For a brief moment, The three of them simply stood together in comfortable silence. A warm spring breeze moved gently through the trees. Margaret looked toward the parking lot where Sophie was happily waiting with a small basket of flowers she had picked on the way. She smiled. "So, what should I keep doing?" Dr. Carter smiled. "The same things that have always made life worth enjoying. The garden. Your family. Your morning walks. The little moments that keep you moving without even thinking about it." Margaret nodded. "I think I can do that." They shared one last smile before walking toward the sunlight together. As Emily watched her mother leave, she realized the story had never really been about opening a jar. It had been about understanding the remarkable body that had quietly carried Margaret through more than 70 years of ordinary life, and learning how to care for that body, without allowing fear to replace joy. Before Margaret reached the garden gate, Dr. Carter called gently after her. "Margaret." She turned with a smile. "Today we talked about strength." He paused for a moment. "But after 70, there's another quiet change that almost every family notices sooner or later." Emily looked back with quiet curiosity. So many people think they're simply getting older, when something much more interesting is happening. Dr. Carter smiled. "We'll talk about that next time." Margaret smiled back. Together, she and Emily continued walking home beneath the warm afternoon sun. Journey was still unfolding. Growing older isn't about holding on to the strength you once had. It's about protecting the life that strength still allows you to enjoy. Thank you for spending these moments with us at Senior Health Essence, where every story begins with life, is guided by science, and ends with hope. Until next time, take gentle care of yourself and of the people you love.